I'm Casey Wheatland. I'm an assistant professor of political science here at New College of Florida. And this weekend, we are going to be exploring elements that made the American Republic exceptional. The policies and philosophical underpinnings of the American founding. When we think of the crises that erupted in early America, foreign policy is often at the front of our minds. How did the United States survive in a world of empires? How did the Patriots not only defeat the most powerful empire in existence in the world at the time and force her to recognize our independence, but how do we continue to survive as an infant nation? These are important and, of course, interesting questions, but I'm going to pose that there is, in fact, a more important and more interesting question. How did America survive as a republic in a world of empires? How do we preserve not only our territory, sovereignty, commerce, and liberty, but our republican government, our free way of life? And I'll be outlining what you could call a prehistory of the Monroe Doctrine. When the American founders turned their attention to national security, they were thinking not only about military and economic power. They recognized these are, of course, necessary to protect your national territory and sovereignty, but they were concerned with something higher. When they thought of national security, they were thinking about how to secure the safety and the happiness of the nation. And the happiness of the nation rested primarily in the maintenance of a political order that was formed, founded on the consent of the governed, and able to secure the natural rights of citizens and preserve and enforce a certain moral order. I argue that the Federalist contains the most comprehensive account of early American grand strategy. Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison attended to the most important and basic elements of statecraft. And when we read the Federalist selectively, as we are wont to do, and last time I was up here I warned against reading the Federalist selectively, we tend to focus specifically on the institutions of the federal government and the theory of constitutionalism. We often forget or do not recognize that the Federalist contains an almost comprehensive account of politics itself. In Federalist 70, Alexander Hamilton speaks of how to establish safety in the Republican sense. And here he's referring to the presidency. How do we reconcile an energetic executive with consent of the governed and representative institutions? But this same phrase, safety in the Republican sense, aptly describes the combined approach that Hamilton, Jay, and Madison take to national security and foreign affairs. Publius offers a comprehensive approach to national security, and specifically how Americans can reconcile safety with our desire for political liberty and a republic. This grand strategy of the Federalist unfolds in three parts. First, there are considerations of national security that are relevant to all nations, republics or otherwise. Second, there are considerations specifically for republics, how they can reconcile the need for safety with their desire for political liberty. And then third and finally, there are specific national security imperatives that speak to the United States and our own peculiar circumstances. So let me begin with the first. In what sense all states must consider their safety? Publius's reflections on national security begin with the second essay, Federalist II, which is titled Concerning the Dangers from Foreign Force and Influence. However, if you read Federalist II, you'll notice that outside of the title, the words foreign force and influence do not appear in the essay. Federalist II rather treats the question of whether Americans should remain one people who find their safety and happiness in union, or if they should be divided into distinct confederacies and sovereignties. Publius argues for a firm union on two grounds. The first is that Americans have a shared national identity anchored in common political, ethnic, and cultural ties. The second is that the American continent, with its fertile soil, economic diversity, and succession of navigable rivers, makes for a unified state in which citizens can easily trade and communicate with one another and produce all necessary goods without reliance on foreign powers. The first two considerations for any state's security are its people and its geography. We must first know what it is that we are to secure. In other words, the people and the territory. And we must also know if those things are defensible. A people that lacks like-mindedness is left prey to internal convulsions and the manipulation of foreign powers. A territory that is geographically disunited or materially poor is difficult to maintain. It is a weak foundation for national power. Right? As Dr. Lippincott pointed out in his talk, the Declaration of Independence asserts a position for the United States among the separate and equal nations in the world, right? A separate and equal station among the nations of the world. Well, the question is, how do you preserve that separate and equal station? How do you preserve that sovereignty? Well, Publius finally gets around to this in the next essay, Federalist 3. He states that the first consideration of a wise and free people is how to provide for their safety. And as we will see, a free government requires an active, deliberative citizen body if it is to preserve both its safety and liberty. Here in Federalist 3, Publius names two distinct dangers from abroad: foreign arms and foreign influence. By foreign arms, Publius means war, and this is the subject of Federalists 3 and 4. He classifies the causes of war as either just or unjust, and explains how each of these can be avoided. Just wars, he says, arise either from violation of treaties or from direct violence. To avoid granting other nations justifiable reasons to wage war against us, a state must obey the law of nations. In other words, the natural law as applied to relations among peoples. But this is easier said than done. For not only must the state itself do this, obey the law of nations, it must also compel its people to obey them as well. Here Publius gives his first defense of the Constitution from an explicit national security consideration. He says an efficient national government will attract the best men to serve it, and they will be more inclined to observe the law of nations than state and local authorities are. As evidence for this, he points to hostilities with Indian tribes that have been sparked by state governments that disregarded and violated binding agreements that they had made with various tribes. Publius then considers the unjust causes of war. These are plentiful. In Federalist 4, John Jay lists personal reasons why a sovereign might declare war, even if it is not in the interest of his nation. These include thirst for military glory, revenge for personal affronts, ambition, or private compacts to aggrandize or support their particular families or partisans. He further lists reasons why a nation might wage an unjust war, and these include things like economic rivalry and insults to national pride. Hamilton continues this point of inquiry in Federalist 6. Because men are ambitious, vindictive, and rapacious, the causes of hostility among nations are innumerable. In addition to the reasons that Jay lists, Hamilton adds fear. Nations will wage war on others out of the desire for equality and safety. You might wage a preemptive war against another nation if you fear its preeminence. In Federalist 7, he names territorial disputes as one of the most fertile sources of hostility among nations. All this is to say it is impossible to list all the unjust causes of war. The remedy to avoiding unjust wars is the capacity to marshal one's own arms against foreign arms. Strength is the ultimate deterrent. Publius says that nations in general will make war whenever they have a prospect of getting anything by it. Twice in Federalist 4, he advises his fellow citizens to avoid inviting war by appearing weak in the eyes of foreign powers. A powerful nation is unlikely to be a target of an unjust war, and even if it is, it has a better chance of repelling its foe and preserving its sovereignty. As will be shown below, this does not necessarily mean that a nation must always maintain a large standing army. Economic power, naval fleets in the right circumstances, and an armed, spirited citizenry can serve as effective deterrents. So that's foreign arms. But then the second threat that Publius identified was foreign influence. And this is not as straightforward. He identifies, in the course of the Federalists, three distinct forms. The first form is the use of overt acts by foreign powers to influence the conduct of another people or government. Publius, in Federalist 3, gives the example of the King of France forcing the ministers of the city of Genoa to pay fealty to him in a humiliating manner. You could also add, post-Constitution, the Edmond Genet, the minister from France, coming to the United States and encouraging Americans to serve as privateers in France's war against Great Britain, even though America had a policy of neutrality. Right? This is an overt action by a foreign nation attempting to influence our own people or government. But the second form of foreign influence is covert actions that influence another people or government. In Federalist 22, Publius lists numerous examples of public ministers accepting bribes from foreign governments. He calls this particular form of foreign influence foreign corruption. And he says that republics are actually particularly vulnerable to this. In some ways, we are more vulnerable to foreign corruption than monarchies. The third form of foreign influence is not necessarily perpetrated by a foreign government. This particular form is explained in Federal 62 by James Madison in his discussion of the Senate. There he says that naturalized citizens must wait 9 years before they can hold office in order to ensure that they are first, quote, thoroughly weaned from the prepossessions and habits incident to foreign birth and education. In this context, foreign influence means that one's way of life has been corrupted by foreign habits, manners, customs, education, or principles of justice. If the security of a state depends in part on its homogeneity, as Publius noted in Federalist II, then the introduction of foreign ways of life threatened to disrupt a state's well-being by rendering it heterogeneous, right? Dividing the people between different factions that support different, ultimately foreign entities. Now, the first form of foreign influence, overt actions, can be counteracted simply by maintaining a powerful nation. Publius notes that France would never have been able to humiliate Spain or England in the same way that it used these strong-arm tactics to subdue Genoa. The second and third forms of foreign influence can only be combated by a state that maintains cultural homogeneity and the rule of law. A people with a distinct national identity and who are loyal to their state will be uncorrupted by foreign bribes or foreign ways of life. On several occasions, Publius notes that those republics that have suffered from foreign corruption had weak administrations, and this encouraged individuals and even entire provinces to seek out patronage from foreign powers. The security of a regime thus depends not only on its capacity to fend off external threats, but the ability to secure the loyalty of its people. Governments accomplish this through effective administration and equal protection under the law. A government that upholds the rule of law and effective administration and protects life and liberty will secure the allegiance of its people in most circumstances. It will not only be more secure against foreign corruption, but also be safe from domestic upheavals. Now, this takes me to the second element of the grand strategy of the Federalist. And these are considerations particular to republics on how to maintain their security and their liberty. Republics have a particular difficulty here, right? Because they're not only concerned with protecting their sovereignty, they have a distinct way of life. They have political liberty that they want to maintain. And in certain circumstances, security and liberty are incompatible. They do not go together. In Federalist 8, Publius contrasts the nature of war on the American continent with war in Europe. In America, the wide frontier, lack of fortifications, and want of professional armies would leave the continent vulnerable to partisan warfare, or to what today we might call guerrilla warfare. He says conquest would be as easy to make as difficult to be retained. War, therefore, would be desultory and predatory. Plunder and devastation ever march in the train of irregulars. The calamities of individuals would make the principal figure in the events which would characterize our military exploits. However, this would not be the case for long. Publius says, safety from external danger is the most powerful director of national conduct. Even the ardent love of liberty will, after a time, give way to its dictates. The violent destruction of life and property incident to war, the continual effort and alarm attendant on a state of continual danger, will compel nations most attached to their liberty to resort for repose and security to institutions which have a tendency to destroy their civil and political rights. To be more safe, they at length become willing to run the risk of being less free. Let me repeat that last line. To be more safe, they at length become willing to run the risk of being less free. Yes, Publius believes that the United States is not immune to this danger. It is simply an element of human nature that a people is willing to surrender its liberty when it believes its safety is at risk. Therefore, Publius claims, if the states are not united by a constitutional union, they will become like Europe. And what took place in Europe? Dr. Lippincott has mentioned an element of this. I'm going to mention another element. Publius says a revolution in the system of war triggered by technological advancement and the development of modern finance has transformed the European landscape. Wars no longer threaten the existence of entire nations. Large professional armies and border fortifications have minimized the destabilizing effects of war in Europe. However, the stability provided by these, what Publius calls regular military establishments, was gained at the price of liberty and economy. Europe had to sacrifice something in order to bracket and limit war. The nations of continental Europe resemble armed camps. Their peoples are burdened with high taxes to maintain their military states. Rival states engage in a costly arms race to maintain their advantage in war. As the soldier becomes more important, the citizen diminishes. Publius writes, again, this is Federalist 8, the military state becomes elevated above the civil. The inhabitants of territories, often the theater of war, are unavoidably subject to infrequent infringements on their rights, which serve to weaken their sense of those rights. And by degrees, the people are brought to consider the soldiery not only as their protectors, but as their superiors. Moreover, the constant danger of war centralizes power in the hands of the executive. Publius refers to the military establishments in Europe as the engines of despotism, and attributes to them the rise of absolute monarchies. And he notes that this phenomenon began in France under King Charles VII, and this developed with the emergence of large standing peacetime armies, and this quickly proliferated across the continent in the 15th century. This explains the predominance of monarchies in continental Europe. In a republic, the executive is checked by a legislative branch, and the legislative branch is naturally the most powerful. However, war shifts the balance of power within a government. It favors the power of the executive, who is in charge of the armed forces and needs to act decisively against national enemies. Therefore, a republic cannot survive if it is constantly at war or if it must field large standing armies in times of peace. That republic is naturally going to evolve into an executive-centered regime. How then can a republic avoid the necessity of military despotism? Publius notes that there is one nation in Europe that has maintained stable institutions of liberty, and that is Great Britain. What distinguishes Great Britain from the continental Europe? Well, it's the fact that Great Britain is not on the continent. The English Channel protected it from imminent invasions. And because of what Publius calls its insular situation, there was no justification to maintain large standing armies. Right? The parliament could emerge and develop and check the powers of the king. All this is to say that to secure liberty, a republic needs a geopolitical situation that protects it from imminent invasion. And as will be seen below, this is not actually simply a matter of happenstance. Right? Geography is an element to this, but human choice and human action is also an element. If standing armies are such a danger to liberty, then why did Publius defend the Constitution against the anti-federalist objection that the Constitution itself permits standing armies? Well, first, Publius argues that not all standing armies are dangerous to liberty. A small standing army cannot tyrannize over a community of manly, spirited citizens. Publius says the citizens, not habituated to look up to the military power for protection or submit to its oppressions, neither love nor fear the soldiery. They view them with a spirit of jealous acquiescence in a necessary evil, and stand ready to resist a power which they suppose might be exerted to the prejudice of their rights. Right? In other words, the civilian is not lower than the soldier. Only an army that's large enough to financially burden the citizenry and interfere in their domestic politics is actually dangerous to Republican liberty. And because the new modes of warfare cannot be effectively waged by citizen militias, a small but disciplined fighting force is needed in case of the outbreak of war. Republics, he goes on to say, also need to have a certain constitutional flexibility. They cannot impose unnecessary limitations on their own power within the Constitution, right? Constitutions, by definition, limit power, but you have to make sure those are necessary limits on power. Publius gives the example of ancient Sparta during the Peloponnesian War. Lysander, who is a great admiral, is twice during the war given the title of admiral of the allied fleets. And this violates the Spartan constitution itself. Under the Constitution of Sparta, you could only serve as admiral once. Lysander is technically the second time given the title of vice admiral, but everyone knows what's really going on. He's really the admiral in charge. And so Sparta had to violate its own constitution. And Publius says, well, this is not something uniquely Spartan. This is natural for states to do such things when their safety is at risk. Therefore, it is best to establish a constitution that takes these things into consideration so as to avoid unnecessarily suspending the Constitution and thereby weakening the rule of law. He says, and this is in Federalist 23, wise politicians will be cautious about fettering the government with restrictions that cannot be observed because they know that every breach of the fundamental laws, though dictated by necessity, impairs that sacred reverence which ought to be maintained in the breast of rulers towards the constitution of a country and forms a precedent for other breaches which, where the same plea of necessity does not exist at all, or is less urgent and palpable. So while republics ought to avoid large armies outside of existential wars, they are unwise to impose constitutional limits on raising armies. A wise and free people, to go back to that phrase from Federalist 3, a wise and free people must constantly deliberate amongst themselves about their national security needs and impose political rather than constitutional limits on the size and power of the military. Now this gets to the third and final considerations. What about America's own position? Given our peculiar circumstances, how can we maintain liberty and security? Well, Publius says in Federalist 8, we are blessed with a situation not unlike Great Britain. We can have our own insular situation if there is a constitutional union strong enough to maintain the unity of the states. So if you form a constitutional union, we will be insulated and isolated from our major rivals. And in fact, we're better off than Great Britain because we don't have a measly channel separating us. We have an entire ocean. In Federalist 14, Publius claims that the Union, the constitutional union, is the only substitute for those military establishments which have subverted the liberties of the old world. Moreover, an extended republic, as Publius says in Federalist 9, combines the advantages of monarchy with the advantages of a republic. It is able, and he is following here the authority of Montesquieu, a confederated republic is able to exert external force like a large monarchy, but also preserve internal institutions of political liberty, uncorrupted, a republic. The enlarged territory permits a larger population with more wealth and resources than a small territory. Therefore, the confederated republic has enough manpower and resources to wage a modern war against other nations. Right? We are not left like those petty republics of Italy, such as Genoa. We are not left to the mercy of large empires. We are able to form and forge a large nation for ourselves to protect ourselves, but also maintain republican political liberty. In the interest of time, I'm only going to briefly mention some of these other, particularly American elements of Publius's national security doctrine. In Federalists 11 through 13, he argues that the Union will further promote national security by creating the conditions for a robust economy and powerful navy. The Navy allows us to keep potential enemies far away, which means we'll have less need for an army. Prudent political economy will encourage manufacturing and commerce, allowing us to produce all of our wants, especially war material, without relying on other nations for our most vital needs. And finally, in Federalist 28, 46, and elsewhere, Publius says that a manly republican spirit of America will deter threats. A large population of armed citizens organized under state governments will dissuade other nations as well as our own federal government from infringing on our liberties. Let me conclude with a brief note on why I think it's important for students to study and grasp this subject. Because this subject of national security itself is often something we think of in high-level political science, higher education, but I think it's a subject that's appropriate at lower levels. I think it's appropriate at the high school level and maybe even before high school. When we teach American history, eager students want to know facts. Young boys especially are often eager to know all the juicy details about American wars, how they were fought, who fought them, what weapons were used, and so on. And while it's of course good for students to know these details, it does not suffice for a truly civic education. It does not suffice to make them into good citizens. Students should know not only what wars have been fought and how they have been fought, but why they have been fought. Right? This speaks to Dr. Lippincott's point in his talk. Why have these wars been fought? Moreover, they should grapple with the question of why one should or should not wage war. Foreign policy is a matter of existential necessity, of life and death. Declaring war, concluding peace, contracting alliances, these are matters of justice that cannot be executed lightly. The founders thought through these matters in serious ways, and I think that we can learn from them. Thank you.
Join us in falling in love with America again.